Demetrius reminds me every time that I'm part of a long heritage of Coast Guard admirals who have been visiting with this group, so I've got to try to live up to that tradition and that reputation. So I just returned from, or just finished up with the Marine Safety Committee at IMO, and I can tell you that particular session was really focused on finishing up a lot of work that had been started in the past, so a lot of little details. There are some discussions there that I'll mention in the course of my remarks today, but I think what you really care about today is where are we with ballast water, where are we with air emissions. There are some port state control issues I want to touch on. And I want to get to all those issues and then get to your questions. But I want to do it within a strategic context in which we look at our work in the U.S. Coast Guard. And that's the context in which we see this industry moving forward in the future. Before we get started, though, I wanted to thank my colleague from the Hellenic Coast Guard for being here and let you know how much we respect the work that your service is doing. We know what it's like to interdict migrants on a much smaller scale, and it's just been incredible to see what your service has done in a humane and heroic way. So congratulations to you. And we have great cooperation, so hopefully that will continue. So if I look ahead for this industry over the next decades to come, we collectively will continue to struggle to meet three grand challenges. The first is to increase the capacity of our marine transportation system worldwide. And it may not feel like that today because demand is down in the global economy, but every study you read will indicate that over the next 50 years, the capacity of the marine transportation system will have to increase by about 50% more than what it is today. And that means we will have a great challenge because you can only build ships so big. You can't make ports much bigger. Together we will have to figure out how to make the system more efficient so we can move things more effectively and increase the capacity of the system. So that's the first challenge, is grow the capacity. But the second challenge, I think you all know and you feel it, is to reduce the environmental footprint of the marine transportation system. And we've had some discussions already this morning about the fact that shipping is already the most environmentally friendly way to move large amounts of cargo. And I don't dispute that, although I don't think it's widely known. But even so, we cannot sustain a linear increase of the environmental footprint of shipping as the capacity grows. So if we need to grow the capacity by 50%, we cannot sustain a 50% increase in environmental footprint. So that's quite a challenge. Grow capacity while reducing environmental footprint. And that's why you see all the focus today on every waste stream coming out of ships. We used to be focused on keeping cargo and fuel where it belongs, preventing pollution by accident. And today we are focused on managing every waste stream that occurs in the normal and proper operation of a ship, which is a very different challenge. And then the third part of the triple challenge, growing capacity while reducing environmental footprint, the third part is really caused by the solution set for the first two, which is dealing with ever-increasing complexity. And everything in shipping is much more complex, and it's growing every day. And it's the complexity of the technology that you use, partially the technology associated with mitigating environmental circumstances, but it's the technology associated with navigation systems, with propulsion systems, management systems, automation systems, but it's also the complexity associated with the international regimes. Maybe you haven't noticed, but everything that comes out of IMO is more complex than the last thing that came out of IMO. And the same is true with very much domestic regulation. And as you see regional regimes, particularly in the European Union, and they like to give me a hard time as an American talking about unilateral regulation, but I think you've seen more of that out of the EU lately than you've seen out of the US. So complexity will continue to grow as well. And that triple challenge, growing capacity while reducing environmental footprint in the face of ever-increasing complexity, will drive the regulatory regime for shipping for our lifetime. So where does that lead us? I won't talk about the capacity challenge because that's yours to deal with mostly. A lot of the capacity challenge will be met through private investment. I think the regulators' role in increasing capacity has to do with things like the e-navigation initiative, and I'm happy to talk about where I think that's going in the question and answers. But the two issues that I think are most interesting to this crowd are the environmental challenge and the dealing with complexity, and that brings in cyber and other things. So let me talk about the environmental challenge first. As I mentioned, this is not your father's or grandfather's environmental regulation. Environmental regulation of today involves much more technologically advanced mitigation measures. So when we were trying to keep fuel in the proper place, we implemented double hull tankers. And double hulls are technologically simple, passive mitigation measures. I can go aboard your ship as a marine inspector. I can see if the double hull is there, and I can know that it will be there tomorrow, and I know that it will be operated correctly, because it's hard to operate a double hull incorrectly. But today we're talking about very technical and specialized ballast water management systems, exhaust gas scrubber systems. Even the marine sanitation devices of yesterday will no longer suffice for tomorrow. And if you haven't noticed, the NGOs, the environmental non-governmental organizations focused on MSDs, watch out because it's next. And so the mitigation measures that we put in place today are much more complex, and the compliance measures associated with them are equally complex. So we take ballast water treatment systems, and I get asked, and maybe this group asked me, I don't know, when I was here 18 months ago, Admiral, how can the United States have in place a standard for which technology doesn't exist today to meet that standard? And my response is, how will technology ever exist if you don't put the standard in place? And this role of the regulator as the forcing function for the innovation that's required to meet that environmental challenge that I spoke about. Because remember, our society will not allow the environmental footprint of shipping to increase linearly with the capacity. So the forcing function that the regulator plays, the dance that we've done with ballast water, will occur again. So where are we with that dance? I think everyone knows the convention was ratified in September, was it? So that the International Ballast Water Convention goes into effect September of 2017. Has very little impact on the ballast water requirements in the United States, because as you know, we have not ratified the convention. But we are not unaware of the implications of the ratification to the global shipping community, particularly given the need to have U.S. type approved systems in place before you need to comply with the international ballast water. So where are we? I think everyone knows in the United States we currently have 19 ballast water treatment systems in testing in our independent labs around the world, including some in Korea and some in Norway, a number in the United States. We have 3 that have submitted their data for type approval. We have 1 that I think you'll see approved maybe as a Christmas present, but very soon. What I would say, though, is that as a ship operator, as a ship owner, you need to understand that a ballast water type approval is different than, say, a lifeboat or a davit type approval or a life raft type approval. Those are much less technical. As you evaluate a type approved system, you need to really read the details of the U.S. type approval. It will reference an operations guide, and it will give you the information that you need to determine whether that system, although it's U.S. type approved, will really work for your ship. So in the U.S. we recognize, and I personally recognize, and I've written about this, that not every ballast water treatment system will work for every ship. And so even though we might have 1 or 2 or 3 U.S. type approved systems out there, we will continue to be very pragmatic in terms of the compliance dates. So right now, I think most of you, if you operate ships, have applied for a U.S. extension. Anybody here apply for a U.S. extension? Right now, we've issued extensions up to 2018. We're issuing 2019 now. As I said, I expect to have at least 1 U.S. type approved system out there soon, if not this year, very early next year. At which point there'll be an option for compliance. And when that option for compliance is out there, ship owners will have to seriously consider whether or not that particular system will work for your ship. And in that consideration, you have to look at our type approval very closely. These ballast water treatment systems are very sophisticated. When we got application for type approval, 6,000 pages. 6,000 pages for one type approval. And that's because it's a very complex system. And many of them are asking for type approval at various flow rates. And so those various flow rates each have to be evaluated. And the type approval will tell you for which flow rate, which power level, which filters, all these things need to be carefully considered when you're determining whether or not a particular system will work for your vessel. So if your compliance date is in 2018, and the U.S. has a type approved system out there, or 2 or 3, and you look at those systems and say, Admiral, none of these will work for my ship because the flow rate's not enough, or whatever it is. Your next communication with the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, regarding ballast water compliance will have to contain some engineering analysis that explains why a particular type approved system just doesn't work for your ship. Or if a system does work for your ship, but the manufacturer doesn't have the capacity to produce enough, then we'll be looking for some evidence of that, whether it be a contract with a manufacturer, a contract with a shipyard that says I can't be in compliance by 2018, but here's the contract that says I will be by 2019. That's the type of objective evidence that we'll need in order to evaluate future applications for extension once there are approved ballast water systems out there. But I think one of the things ship owners should be really focused on, and I'll talk about it within the context of ballast water, but it's true for environmental regulation writ large, is that merely putting a type-approved system on a ship is not enough to ensure compliance with the standard. And this is different than other type-approved equipment. If you put a type-approved lifeboat on a ship, or a life raft, or a davit, you're in compliance. That's de facto evidence of compliance. That's not so with ballast water treatment systems. In addition to buying and installing a type-approved system, you have to ensure that the crew and the chief engineer understand how to operate it in a way that will achieve compliance. And you have to have in place contingency plans for operations if the system isn't working for whatever reason. All this will be in your ballast water management plan that's required by our regulation, but it's something that ship owners and operators should be thinking about today. If you have an oil-water separator today and it malfunctions, you have plans so the chief engineer knows what to do with oily waste until the system can be repaired. If you have a ballast water treatment system that isn't functioning, what do you do with that ballast water? What is the chief to do? You better think about that before you enter a U.S. port and port state control comes aboard. We see the system isn't working. We ask, what happened to your ballast water? So we need to start thinking about compliance in those situations ahead of time. So the ballast water management plan addresses that. Are there options? I believe there are options. I believe, in exigent circumstances, certainly, if ever the safety of the ship is in doubt, the master can make the decision to load or deballast. But if the system is broken and there's been reasonable effort to get tech aboard to fix it, what are the options? Mid-water exchange. These are the types of things that I think that make the compliance challenge with ballast water much more difficult than with other environmental standards that we've seen before. And the same will be true as we move for greenhouse gas emissions, as we move for underwater noise reduction, as we push to reduce environmental footprint from every waste stream of the ship. The compliance challenge is something that we're going to have to work on together. The 2020 sulfur cap, I think everyone knows that MEPC 2020 was decided as the date. There was actually very little debate about that. I'm not sure if anyone here was surprised about that, but I was. In our analysis afterwards, I think one of the reasons why the member states at IMO decided to move ahead with the 2020 date with so little debate is because of the pressure they're feeling from COP21 and other environmental fora, where if IMO does not look to be taking a leadership within the shipping community, others will. And the IMO member states want to maintain leadership for shipping with this environmental challenge. And that's why I think IMO needs to be as aggressive as reasonably possible when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and other future environmental challenges. So that's the environmental challenge. It's not our father's environmental challenge. It's much more complex. The solutions are more complex. How many of you are running scrubbers? Anybody running scrubbers? No? Well, as you know, in the United States, the North American ECA has driven the development of exhaust gas scrubbers for those vessels that spend a lot of time in our ECA. That would be cruise ships, for example, Jones Act vessels, those that trade between the United States and Puerto Rico, the United States and Alaska, the United States and Hawaii. And so we've gained a lot of experience with scrubbers, and we've learned a lot about the compliance challenges associated with scrubbers. And as scrubbers, like anything else, don't always work. And when the scrubber stops working, it's not reasonable to stop the ship. And so we've worked very hard with the operators of scrubbers so that we can do averaging schemes. Sometimes you're scrubbing below the 0.1, sometimes it's above the 0.1, but what is the documentation that's required? All these are compliance challenges that we haven't yet gotten to at IMO, but the U.S. certainly intends to advance a paper to talk about port state control guidelines for vessels that are operating scrubbers. So I'm happy to take questions on environmental challenges. Let me move, if I could, to the complexity issue. When I talk about complexity, I think about the challenges that are associated with safety management systems today, with ISPS. One of the things that we talked about at MSC last week was the upcoming full implementation of STCW 2010. 1 January 17 is the full implementation date. I made an intervention at IMO and I said, in the U.S., we have really struggled to ensure that all of our mariners have all the proper certificates to meet the 1 January 17 date. We had to work very hard with our training institutions, with our industry, and most importantly with our mariners. And we think that we'll get there, but we're going to be really pushed. At the same time, we're working hard with our port state control officers so they know what to do to verify substantial compliance with the STCW in January. But my concern is that there are flag administrations around the world, who have not yet been able to issue the necessary certificates to all their seafarers. And at the end of the day, it's not those administrations that will pay the price if we have to detain ships and strand seafarers. I'm quite concerned about stranding seafarers because, in a port state control environment, if we find a number of seafarers on a vessel who don't meet the STCW requirements, the response may be to send other seafarers and leave those ashore. And that's a tough position to put those seafarers in. So I proposed a resolution at IMO that would encourage all flag administrations to get these certificates issued, but also encourage a pragmatic solution or pragmatic approach to port state control for the first 6 months after January 2017. And that passed at IMO. In the U.S., what that means is that if we go aboard a ship and the seafarers don't have the STCW certificates that are required, we will contact the flag administration. And if that administration says, yeah, that's our fault, we didn't have the capacity to get those certificates out, then we'll take a practical view and probably won't detain the ship. If the administration says no reason why they shouldn't have those certificates, then we'll probably detain the ship, and those seafarers will probably have to be replaced. So, to the extent that you can influence the administrations of the flags that your ships fly, so that they cover for their seamen, I think that would be a good thing. Then the last topic I want to hit on before I take questions is cybersecurity and cyber risk management. I spoke with this group, I think, last time I was here about cyber. And my view is in the last 2 years or so in the U.S. Coast Guard, our goal has been to just begin the discussion about cyber, to talk about cyber not as a 0 and 1 technical issue, but as an operational risk management issue, to understand that we operate in cyber today the way that we also operate in physical space. And so the same approach that we take to managing the operational risk associated with a main propulsion system needs to be applied to manage the operational risk associated with a cyber system. We've, I think, done well in terms of generating that discussion and generating the awareness. And one of the proof of that is the IMO interim cyber risk management guidelines, which many of you are familiar with. We had a proposal from Iran at MSC this last session to make those guidelines mandatory. That did not receive much support, including no support from the U.S. But it is indicative of the fact that many flags are looking to IMO to come up with a permanent solution for how to manage cyber risk. Our position is let's put these interim measures in place, let's let the industry use them, and then talk about the way forward. I think those interim guidelines will go final at the next session of MSC in May of 2017. But at that same session, the U.S. will likely bring forth a paper that proposes full integration of cyber risk management into ISM. Because in the future, your ships will, when they're designed and constructed, the cyber systems will be considered in that process the same way physical systems are today. So in the same way that your hull structure is built to a class standard, the same way that your propulsion system meets classification standards, so will the automation and cyber systems. So the ship of the future will have a class notation indicating its compliance with cyber risk management standards. And the level of that notation will depend on the sophistication of the ship. So a DP4 drilling vessel will probably have to have a CS3 notation, cybersecurity 3. A minimally automated bulker may only need a CS1. But the ship of the future will consider cyber risk management in the design and construction and classification of the vessel, the same way that it's done today for physical systems. And the ship of the future will manage the operations and maintenance of cyber systems the same way it does today for physical systems, which is through the ISM and through the safety management system. Now, I hope that we can march down that path in a very measured and practical way, and that we can get there with the industry in the lead. And I applaud the efforts of the industry roundtable for the cyber guidelines that they've put out. And I think as long as the industry and the IACs and others are leading, I think the industry is in a great place. If, on the other hand, We have a major cyber incident. I think we all know how reactive regulators can be. But our goal in the U.S. is, particularly for ships, is to not move ahead with unilateral regulation for cyber risk management, and to work this through the international industry and through the IMO. And I think we're making good progress. So that's where we want to shoot in the future. You will see in the U.S. this year cyber risk management guideline or cyber risk management requirements, hard requirements for our highest risk port facilities, which are those that transfer and store a large amount of hazardous liquid cargoes. And that will be a requirement. And that's phase 2 of our approach to cyber. So phase 1 was building awareness. Phase 2 is to require cyber governance at highest risk facilities. Phase 3 will be actual regulation, but that will be focused on our port facilities and terminals. So I want to leave it at that and take your questions. I have a lot else I could address, of course, but I'm anxious to hear from you guys. Anything I can address? If not, I'll keep talking. Sir.
Thomas, I would like to express our appreciation for the very formative speech. But on the other hand, I would like to know the way of proceeding, of facing the ballast water management issue as concerns the United States Coast Guard after the last decision for renewing the guidelines G8.
The G8 guidelines? Well, we worked hard at the last MEPC to do a couple things. The problem as we see it in the U.S. with the G8 guidelines, one, they're not mandatory. Two, they're subject to broad interpretation. And three, they don't require independent testing. And so essentially, there's self-certification by a manufacturer that has been accepted by many flags. I think there's been broad international recognition now that systems approved under the G8 guidelines have been approved by many different administrations in many different ways, and so there's no assurance that those systems actually meet the discharge standard. I don't know if anyone in this room wants to argue with me on that, but the IMO themselves did a study on all of the currently approved ballast water treatment systems and determined there's no way to know for sure that those systems will actually result in compliant discharges. So our work at MEPC was to stiffen up the G8 guidelines so that the systems approved under those guidelines would be reliable, and so that ship owners would know if they bought a G8 system that they have a better than even chance that they would actually meet the discharge standard. We did not get as far as we wanted to at MEPC. The guidelines will now be mandatory. They do not require independent testing, which in the U.S. is a showstopper. We really believe that you need a certification beyond just the manufacturer certification. And so at the end of the day, although the G8 guidelines are better than they were, I don't think they have, I don't think we've yet gotten to the place where you can, with confidence, buy a system that meets the G8 guidelines and have confidence that it will also meet the U.S. guidelines. And that's why I advise, to the extent that I'm qualified to advise you, if you're looking at a system and that manufacturer has not even indicated an intention to apply for U.S. type approval, you probably ought to look at a different system. As I said, we have 19 currently being tested. Those 19 are listed on our website. So we're going to keep working on the G8 guidelines, but as of the last MEPC session, we didn't get as far as we really had hoped to. Any other?
As everybody knows, scrubbers represent, at least technically, according to regulations, a valid alternative for solving the SOx problem. However, certain administrations, they do not allow the wash water discharge in certain areas, although technically maybe prove that it meets the standards. In estuaries, protected waters, in coastal waters, certain administrations do not, and this is a big barrier for the introduction of this technology. What is the practice in US?
So I'm not sure if everyone hear the question, but it was essentially about exhaust gas scrubbers in open versus closed systems. And right now in the U.S., open systems are accepted, and we have a number of them operating. But if you go back to the triple challenge is growing capacity, reducing environmental footprint, and increasing complexity, I don't think environmental NGOs will accept open loop scrubbers for long, and particularly not beyond the 2020 date. So I believe that there needs to be some innovation around closed loop scrubbers. Now there are some out there, but they have challenges. A number of the cruise ships in the U.S. operate systems that can be either open or closed, so they can go to different countries. But one of the biggest challenges with closed-loop scrubbers is now you have all this sulfur on board. What do you do with it? And so in fixing one environmental challenge, we fix another. And I think everybody knows reception facilities around the world are probably not the right answer. But this is another area where I believe the innovation will be forced by regulators. Now, the administrations that currently do not accept closed loop or open loop scrubber are doing so on their own volition. That's not the international standard. In the U.S., we currently do accept open loop scrubbers. We have a new administration, so I'm not sure if in the next 4 years that will change, but we certainly have a lot of pressure. That's one of the things you have to understand about the U.S. and probably about most administrations, is that we get pressure from lots of sides, and I can tell you in my position, one of the reasons why we've been as adamant as we have with regard to the ballast water approval process is that if the environmental NGOs around the world, but in particular in the States, look at our type of approval process and determine that it does not lead to systems that reliably meet the discharge standard, they will bring us to court, because you can do that in the U.S. And then the discharge standard itself will be opened up for discussion. And you may know that there are groups in the United States who have advocated for a discharge standard 100 times more restrictive than the one we currently have in place. And so I don't think that would be a good thing for the industry. So we're trying to balance both sides constantly. I know I saw a question over here. Sir.
Thank you. I'm Mr. Sabatakakis, Technical Advisor of the Union Greek Shipbuilders. Thank you very much, Grab, for enlightening us on the current U.S. requirements and the future perspective. I returned recently from a regional conference at Zagreb on ballast water management, where all stakeholders were present. Following a presentation by a number of manufacturers who are on the first line of having applied, and they are very, let's say, convinced that they will be the first two to receive the type of work by the end of the year.
Yeah.
They have admitted openly that there's no, one size doesn't fit all. I mean, and this, when it comes to sizable dry bulkers and oil tankers with ballast water rates over 2,000 cubic meters per hour. So the objective evidence, more or less, is there. So I would like to kindly ask you whether, at the level of an operator, would it be extremely difficult to prove its case by providing, let's say, some engineering files where this technology will not be applicable to this case?
So I mentioned how complicated these type of approvals are. Many, we have 3 applications, but all 3 of the applications we have submit data for 1 or 2 flow rates, and then submit an engineering analysis to justify scaling those flow rates. So in other words, I only tested at these 2 flow rates, but here's my engineering analysis that shows it should also work at these others. So if you're asking me as a ship owner, you're going to be doing the same kind of scaling analysis, and here's why I don't believe it will work on my ship at these flow rates. I think you have to look very carefully at the type approval, because we will list the flow rates for which the tests, identify that the test results were generated, and the flow rates for which we accepted the engineering scaling calculations. I would think it would be difficult to come back to the Coast Guard and say we don't agree with the scaling calculations that are in your type approval. If you're following my, so if you see a system that's approved for a certain flow rate, you know that you need a different flow rate, higher. You do a calculation that says this system won't work at that flow rate for these reasons, and that flow rate is not in the current type approval, then I'd say you'd be on good grounds to come back and say this system won't work on our ship. But I don't think you'll be in good grounds if that flow rate is actually included in the U.S. type approval. Because we've done a great deal of study. We've used the Naval Research Lab, the U.S. Naval Research Lab, we spent a lot of money studying the scalability of these issues. But it's a very complex system. So if you want to change out a filter, if you want to change out a power pack, so this is why it takes so long. Most people would believe that the power supply itself is not that critical to the functioning of the ballast water treatment system. Plug it into anything and it should work. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There are some systems where the technical specifications of the power supply, particularly UV systems, are critical to achieving the test results that they achieve. So to change out a power supply would require another analysis and maybe even another type approval. Very, very complex systems.
Yes, on the same issue, I would like to inquire about the intentions of the Coast Guard as regards the applications for a U.S. extension to the installation of the ballast water management system for the vessels that have a due dry docking date in 2019. And I'm saying 2019 because we have received, and thank you for this, your approval for the extensions up to 2018. I noticed that you said that the approval of at least one ballast water management system will not be the end of the extensions, but we would like to propose to the Coast Guard to consider granting the extension also for 2019, because this will give us a unique opportunity to have a uniform and harmonized system between the U.S. Coast Guard and the IMO system, provided that the IMO will grant also a 2 years extension to the implementation of the convention. So I know that it's not an easy answer to be given, but please consider granting the extension also for the 2019.
So let me just, when I look at what we can do, and I think it was here about 18 months ago that I told you we would grant extensions beyond 1 year, we'd grant the next dry dock. I have to be very careful about extensions because they have to be carefully considered and justified. Once there are U.S. type approved systems, our ability to grant waiver extensions like we did, all vessels essentially, to the next dry dock, becomes very limited. And again, because there are many environmental groups watching us, if we have a U.S. type approved system and we continue to grant waiver extensions, that will come under great scrutiny and maybe even lawsuits. And those lawsuits can not be good, right, in terms of the implications for the standard itself. So once we have type approved systems, those extensions are going to have to be made on a case-by-case basis. And you're going to have to say my compliance date is 2019. Here are the type approved systems that are in existence. This one will work for me, but I can't get it because the manufacturer doesn't have capacity, but here's my contract. Or none of them work for me, here's my engineering analysis. And even then, the extension dates will then be determined based on that particular engineering analysis. So I cannot promise you that we will grant waiver extensions. It just doesn't work once there are systems out there. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I'm Professor Michael Skoulos. I'm an oceanographer and marine chemist, and since the establishment of MEPA, scientific advisor. allow me to rather reflect on 3 points I found extremely important you said. First one is about, you mentioned the NGOs will not allow, then you said society will not allow. I believe that the system does not allow. Actually, it is not a matter of only political pressure. It is a matter of facts. And one of the things, the second thing you said about the leadership or not leadership of IMO. I'm in my way from Marrakesh, in the International Action Ocean Day in Marrakesh. In the panel, IMO was not represented. Your country was represented, and they said that you have designated an area, a protected area bigger than Africa, that very few people know. I would like to come back to that, because many times also in our board the discussion is, yes, we follow closely IMO, but at the same time I think, as you said, it has to be stimulated. I'm saying that because a few days ago we had in the European Parliament, I represent the European Parliament, the board of the European Environment Agency, there were many voices from all different parties of the Parliament asking for greenhouse gas, more stringent standards. The argument is not only innovation, it's that the system does not allow us any longer and cannot be a sector that is not following SDGs and all the rest. I would like to know to have your reflection on that. I mean, why I'm saying that? It is not that IMO at the moment provides enough shelter for policies. It is a new era, and we have to understand that. And this is guided not only by the reactions of others, but the fact that the industrial sectors that have more future are the ones that are proactively moving there. And I would like to have your reflection.
Well, I don't think I could have said it better. I think that is my message. This grand challenge for shipping for the next decades, increasing capacity while reducing environmental footprint and dealing with ever-increasing complexity, is not going away. And the best way to get at that challenge is proactively. So in many other industries, the industries themselves are sponsoring innovation programs, research programs, university programs that look at how do we reduce our environmental footprint. We are talking about ballast water treatment systems, but I don't know of anybody who's sponsoring a competition for the next generation ballast-free tanker or minimum ballast tanker or for the next generation low-emission vessel. So right now, shipping is being pushed only by the system, which, by the way, reflects society, and that's why I say society won't put up with it. But a proactive industry, and there are many of them around the world, the proactive industry will get out ahead of that and look at those challenges in a way that makes the best business sense, rather than being reactive to whether it be IMO, whether it be the EU, whether it be the US. So I put that out there because I don't think this environmental challenge is going away. I don't think it ends at ballast water. I think you will see, unless you get out ahead of it, you will see regulations in the future that require technology that does not exist. And whether that's technology to reduce underwater noise or to reduce the greenhouse gas or to reduce strikes to whales, whatever it is, if the innovation doesn't occur because of private sector generation, then it will occur because it will be spurred by the regulator. And that's what you see with ballast water. So I agree with your premise there.
Another issue? Admiral, you briefly mentioned
You already have the
e-navigation.
toughest questions.
Could you please tell us a few words on where do you think this is going, e-navigation?
Well, I think e-navigation is a good story. In the U.S. at least, and maybe here as well, I think initially e-navigation was viewed as an initiative to remove physical aids to navigation. And certainly in the U.S. that's not what it's about. I like to say everybody has GPS in their cars now, right? but at least in the U.S., we haven't taken down the street signs. And the same is true on the water. But I do think e-navigation is a key public sector component to meeting the capacity challenge. And what do I mean by that? Again, you will build bigger ships until it's no longer practical. Ports can only grow so much. But when it comes to using a system more efficiently and making more effective decisions in a more congested port system, you need better information. You need exquisite situational awareness. And that's what e-navigation is about, is getting the right information to the right people, both ashore and afloat, at the right time to help them make the best decisions. So, for example, in the U.S., this past winter, or 2 winters ago now, some of you were operating on the Hudson River, but we had, 50-year ice on the Hudson River, and it took all of our physical buoys out. But we had critical cargoes that need to make it up the Hudson River because people would freeze without the heating oil. We were very quickly able to install virtual aids to navigation that professional mariners can see on their systems and professional mariners can use to allow that system to reopen before we could physically put buoys back in place. Now that's a capacity increasing measure. And that's a measure that is public owned, but obviously the private sector uses it. Many other examples. We're experimenting now with adaptive traffic separation schemes. Just like your HOV lanes. I don't know if you have HOV lanes, but if you've been to Washington, anyone been to Washington? We have lanes that go one way for the morning commute and another way for the afternoon commute. We're going to need that in our critical sea lanes in the future. We need smart, adaptive technology to sense the traffic and adjust the schemes automatically. In the U.S., I don't know how many people here use this little app they call Waze, W-A-Z. Anybody seen it? So you have. So what Waze does is you're driving around Washington, D.C., you can understand the traffic all around the city because your phone is talking to my phone, and we don't know it, but they're talking to each other. And so it's user-derived situational awareness. Waze on the water is coming, where every vessel is providing information that feeds the overall picture. That's what e-navigation is about. It's about leveraging technology to get everybody the best information possible. In the U.S. this summer, we prototype a smart lock program on our inland waterways that broadcasts to all users the status of the lock, the wind conditions, the current conditions, who's up next, so you can plan your voyage. Maybe it's better to slow down because if I didn't slow down, I'd get there and end up waiting anyways. And that's the type of, that's what we're looking at when it comes to e-navigation. But in our view, it's not about removing physical aids because we think those will always be a key part of the system. Sir? Well, again, so when I look at cybersecurity, there's 2 pieces in my mind. There's shipboard cyber risk management and port facility cyber risk management. I can move forward unilaterally on port facilities in the U.S., and we will. I don't think that port facilities and cyber risk is a good place for IMO to go. We went there with ISPS, but it was hard to do. And if anybody watched the container weight fiasco this past summer, you recognize that it's hard for IMO to reach in and touch terminals. So I think that belongs to a coastal nation, the terminal piece. So the timeline on cyber risk management in the U.S. on terminals is pretty aggressive, and we will require some cyber risk management measures in place at U.S. bulk liquid terminals in the next year. Now, let's go back to ships. Shipping is a global enterprise. There should be one global standard. The best way to get to one global standard for ships is through IMO. And as I said, I think it will require both class societies and IMO to get to the problem. How fast do we move? Most of the class societies are already offering cyber notations for vessels. And I would suggest if you're in the business of buying ships and you have a new build, you might want to consider a CS notation or something similar for a couple of reasons. One is these ships are more highly automated. We have I don't know, are anyone aware of the types of cyber problems we found on ships? I mean, it's incredible. If you design and construct a ship without seriously considering the cyber systems the same way you consider the propulsion system, when you design a propulsion system, you match the propeller to the shaft, to the reduction gear, to the prime mover. If you don't think about your cyber systems the same way, you're going to have serious problems regardless of whether it's a security issue. And so we have found, for example, critical cyber systems on ships that are on the same server as, the system the crew uses to go online, and that's a problem. So I think basic design criteria for cyber systems on ships is required. The timeline, I don't know. Something happens, that timeline will be very far accelerated. If you wait for IMO, one of the good things I've seen at IMO is that industry is pushing them, because I think the industry understands we need to get at this issue. But there are, of course, IMO can take a long time to do anything. So I can't predict the timeline. Any other thoughts? Okay.
I'd just like to say something. You mentioned that you expect trade to grow. Yes, of course. The question is how much? Because we know and we hear and we see that globalization is more or less reducing, or the rate of growth of globalization is going down. Yes, population is increasing, but you have a very interesting group of papers done by your National Bureau of Economic Research, basically talking about time as a trade barrier, which say that any extra day delay in the delivery of cargo can cost something between 0.6 to 2.1% of the value of the cargo, which starts becoming massive numbers. Mm-hmm. Now, you will have ships that have a ship life of 25 years or thereabouts. So you could expect that you won't have phased out the existing technology ships for another 20 years or so, the vast majority. So, by doing all kinds of things, basically, to reduce their emissions, which is basically reducing their speed, you come up against the findings of that study, which start making transport by sea not cost efficient. To this extent, I'd just like to remind you that you can ship, let's say, containers from the center of China, Chongqing, to Duisburg in Germany in 14 days, whereas you would take about 30 days by ship, or 28 or something like that, depending on the speed at which they do. There is a vast difference in the time cost for that kind of shipment. So the more time-sensitive, let's put it this way, or cost-sensitive cargoes do go by train. But if that happens more and more, you will have more things going by train, which would, per ton of cargo carried, emit the damn sight more. So, you have to be able to balance the whole ecological equation with cost functions. And I think that we're looking at it segment to segment to segment to segment, and that is meaningless. It's an integrated system, and you have to look at it that way. You talked about integrated systems. I
couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, I'm not in charge of the integration of the global transportation system, but I have the frustration even in the U.S., our Department of Transportation doesn't manage a system, they manage it by mode. And so, for example, in the U.S., we're moving more crude by rail than ever, which is the most expensive, most dangerous, and least environmentally friendly way to move crude, although we have plenty of capacity on our inland waterways. So, but that said, there are a number of studies that show, for a number of reasons, including elevating global standard of living, that we need to move more stuff around the world. At the same time, there are a number of studies, and you mentioned them, that show the most economically advantageous way to move a lot of stuff is by sea. I think that this industry has not done a good job of telling the story of shipping as the most environmentally not only economically but environmentally viable way to meet the world's transportation needs of the future. I think, and again, this is just my opinion, but I think one of the ways to improve the way that this industry tells that story is to improve transparency. So we have the technology today to monitor every waste stream and to know in real time the impact on our environment. And we have the technology today to make that part of the competitive picture in shipping. So you say we should slow all ships down. I don't believe in that. I don't believe that's a market-based solution, and I believe in market-based solutions. If you slow all ships down, then you have to have a way by which someone can get a competitive edge on the basis of environmental performance. Okay, so we'll set a base speed limit, but you got to below that speed limit if you're a lower than average environmental performer based on real transparency and real measures. And you can get a competitive edge by going faster if that gives you a competitive edge, if you can demonstrate better environmental compliance. But this requires real metrics. It requires the investment in the technology. I'm sorry, I'm speaking too fast. I can tell she just gave me it requires the investment to marinize the technology that currently exists on a lot of shore-based infrastructure that allows them to know environmental impact in real time and to adjust their operations accordingly. So, for example, when it comes to the 2020 sulfur cap, people come to my office all the time. Admiral, I want to comply, but I want to make sure you make sure he complies as well. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to compete. And I'm sympathetic to that. It's a fair question, in which I respond, well, if you're willing to put an exhaust gas monitor into your stack, transmit that data to my desk, I'll look at it, and as long as it's within reason, then I'll focus on him and not you. Now, of course, that's an extreme example, but my point is, to the extent that the industry can increase transparency, the regulator can focus on where there's either no transparency or where there's clear problem. And the rest of the industry can continue to operate on a level playing field. And it's that type of compliance scheme, whether it be a regulatorily required or it become an industry standard. If a BP or a major will not charter a vessel unless it has environmental monitoring that is transparent, that becomes part of the market. That's a market-based solution to do two things: level the playing field and meet the grand challenge around the environmental footprint. But I don't think that's something that will ever come from regulators.
And I have a follow-up. IMO passed this MRV thing.
Yep.
That's beautiful. Why not? But for
It's beautiful. It's the first person I've ever heard say MRV was beautiful.
Well, but it's not elegant, let's put it this way, in a way that we would understand. The question is, fine, it's work done, but is that the work that the ship is actually doing? Because if you're in a seaway and you have waves and currents and this and that and the other, your engine is fighting the waves, the currents, etc. And for example, naval architectural books say that for low-powered ships, in bad weather, they've been known not to move forward at all, and that's a fact of life. So let's put it this way. We note that your slip, measured per day, at least we do, can range from, let's say, minus 10, 12 or something like this, to plus 50%. So if your engine's actually working, and we're talking about a ship that's functioning well, okay, let's put it this way. It hasn't gotten dirty between day 1 and day 2. So you get this kind of information, which is the real information in the work done by the engine of the ship to move the ship in that environment, because we're not traveling on rails. And then you collect all kinds of data that has all that disparity, and therefore you have data that is totally meaningless in the MRV, or relatively meaningless in the MRV, averaged over the time. And that reminds me, at Aldrich, we used to say that, you know, if you have one foot in ice water and the other foot in 72.
Yeah, it's relatively comfortable.
Yeah, you're comfortable with 56.
Well, so I think the argument for MRV is twofold. One, it's better than the proposed alternative, which is simply to measure fuel consumption. And two, those discrepancies that you talk about will be averaged out over a large amount of data. And I agree with both those arguments, but I also agree with you that it's very imperfect. The best measurement is, what am I doing environmentally? What is my actual environmental performance? What's coming out of my stack? As I mentioned, the technology exists today to measure that, to record it, and to analyze it. The actual environmental impact can be measured. This industry can answer the question, can make MRV totally obsolete by simply agreeing to a standard that says we will measure the actual environmental impact, whether it be from our main propulsion or from our ballast water or from our MSDs or from our underwater noise. And until we're ready to get to that level of transparency, it's going to be very difficult to tell the world the story of how well shipping does in terms of environmental performance vis-a-vis other means. So, in the meantime, we'll have imperfect solutions, and MRV is one of them.
How would what you say, which I agree with completely, there's no doubt about it, but how would that account for the extra resistance of waves or the currents, etc., etc.?
Well, you're going to know your actual environmental impact, and you're going to be able to compare it to other vessels on the same route, providing the same service. And you have to assume that the variations associated with weather are going to average themselves out over a large enough period of time.
It's like saying the EOI means something, and to me it's a random number generator. So that's why transparency, we're all for it, but it's a very difficult issue.
I recognize
because
that.
If you ask the European Union what's transparency, for them it's the EOI. You ask RightShip, it's their electrical appliance grading system, ABC. And we've been trying here, to us this is not transparency, this is just fog and irrelevant information. Real transparency is difficult. We need to find something that everybody agrees. We've been trying that for years because people are saying, okay, you don't like AOI, what do you propose? And there is nothing that would work that you can propose. So you have something that means nothing. It's nonsense. And because we don't have anything better, we'll be using that.
Right. No, I agree.
It doesn't make any sense.
I'm simply suggesting that up to now, the measures that we've discussed are all based on how a vessel is operated rather than actual measurements of output. And the technology exists today to actually measure output. Now, whether or not you trust it, whether or not, but that's a mind shift. That's the mind shift that moves this industry to the next plateau.
Because keep in mind, so far charterers don't have a particular problem recognizing which ships are more efficient.
Yeah.
Right, by the traditional, okay, I have that much cargo to move at this speed.
Right.
Tell me what consumption you can.
Charterers understand that, but the world doesn't, right? So that's
right.
The issue.
So with that nature, we move to something that's practical and good, and actually presents a true picture of the efficiency of the ship. That's the hard thing.
I agree. It's a challenge. So before I leave, if there's no other questions, I wanted to quickly mention Qualship 21 and where we are, particularly with the Greek flag. I think everyone knows that unfortunately last year we dropped 13 flags from Qualship 21. And in my analysis of how and why that occurred, I think it's directly linked to the complexity challenge that I mentioned. And many of the detentions that we saw were related to safety management systems that were not well implemented. And I think in most cases what I've seen are very well designed, well documented safety management systems, but not very well implemented safety management systems. And it goes back to what we're asking our crews to do, increasingly complex. You may remember that we lost a U.S. flag vessel a year ago, October, the El Faro. And in the course of that investigation, which, by the way, has been the most transparent marine casualty investigation in U.S. Coast Guard history, all the hearings have been broadcast online, all the transcripts are available. But in the course of that investigation, it became very apparent that the operating company essentially said, well, the master's in charge. Every decision made was his, and he's not here to testify, so I guess we'll never know. And I think that's a very unfortunate. I've been a ship captain. I understand the responsibility and autonomy that comes with command at sea. But I think in today's world, if our masters and our crews afloat are not very well supported from the shore, we're setting them up for failure. The systems that we have in place in terms of compliance systems are very, very complex. And the mentality that the masters got it, well, that's what's resulting in ships getting detained at record rates in the United States. I don't know. I haven't said, I haven't looked at the Greek flag detentions. I'm not saying that it's the issue of ships flying the Greek flag, but I'm just saying that as we move to cyber standards, we move to more complex environmental standards, your ship's crews need help. And to simply say, here's the book, make it happen, that's what you're seeing play itself out in the detention rates in the U.S. Because we go aboard, last 2 years, I told my port state control officers to start asking questions about safety management system. And we go aboard, and when they don't know what the word means or what the term means, that's a problem. And we've seen that, and I can show you pictures and other things of conditions on ships that are clearly outside of the realm that any of you would expect on a ship. That said, I have been approached by a number of larger flags to ask us to reconsider the way that we calculate Call 21. Right now it's a straight ratio for detention, and we're looking at the statistical methods that are used by Tokyo and Paris MOUs, and I think I'll finish that assessment up probably this year and make a decision. If we do decide to change the way that we calculate it, then we'll look back at last year's results and recalculate those as appropriate. But we want to see the Greek flag in our Call Ship 21 program. I know you want to see the Greek flag in the Call Ship 21 program. I think you still have a certificate with my signature hanging there now. Well, unfortunately, it won't be there next year. But it is a priority for us. Call 21 is one of our key programs that help us not only, we think, help raise the level of quality around the world, but helps us manage our workload. And we need all the help we can get right now with that. So with that, any last questions? Demetrius, did I forget anything?
You have amazed me completely, believe me. I wish I would have understood half of what you said.
Oh, wow. So if I spoke too fast for anybody, just please see me afterwards, and I'm happy to.
Congratulations, you did an excellent
job. All right. Thank you all.
Admiral, thank you in commemoration of this visit here. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
She wants to get a picture of her.
Just a second, I have to look thinner.
Me too.